Welcome to the first event hosted by S4Geo, the Society for Geopolitics. I'm Roger Baker, a co-founder of S4Geo. S4Geo is envisioned as a community where geopolitical risk intelligence analysts and internationally engaged corporations can come together to assess and improve tools and techniques, ensure relevance for business interests and operations, and collaboratively strengthen the field of applied geopolitics. Working together with business schools, we will use these insights to help integrate geopolitical risk thinking and processes into business education from the start, enhancing business competitiveness in a changing global system. S4Geo is not another analysis shop or consultancy. It is a convening body for the emerging industry to share ideas and challenges, to hone tools and techniques, and to provide actionable guidance to current and future analysts. We're excited to have you join us here today at our very first virtual event. And today I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Parag Khanna, founder and CEO of AlphaGeo, an AI-powered geospatial analytics platform. Dr. Khanna is the author of several books, including Move, Where People Are Going for a Better Future. The Future is Asian, Commerce, Conflict, and Culture in the 21st Century, and the 2016 Connectography, Mapping the Future of Global Civilization. Today he'll be presenting on In Search of Equilibrium, from the global Rimland to Open Network. Before I hand it over, a few housekeeping items. Today's presentation is being recorded, and we will have time for questions at the end. You may enter your questions at any time into the chat feature, and we will address as many as possible in the time allotted. Dr. Parag Khanna, thank you for joining us here today. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Roger, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. First, of course, a word of thanks, appreciation, and congratulations to you and Michael for getting the Society for Geopolitics launched. It's one of those entities where you say if it didn't exist, you'd have to invent it. And the only thing better than an idea whose time has come is an idea that has finally been born. So really, congratulations to you. And I know it has a great future. And right off the bat, of course, this pairing of the terms applied and geopolitics is so critical now more than ever. It strikes one as a gap when I hear you say it, a gap that finally has been filled. So it's really a great relief as well that you've done this. So really congratulations. And I hope this is the first of many encounters that we will have together. And since it is applied geopolitics in a way, many people study, analyze geopolitics itself and investigate geopolitical questions. But one question that maybe doesn't come up enough, and I'm only going to begin by teasing it, is what is the purpose of geopolitics? What is it for beyond it as a study of the relationship between power and space? What is the end state we wish to achieve? And perhaps I inadvertently titled the presentation in such a way that it is seeking to, maybe by the end of not just my presentation, but our discussion and beyond, maybe we'll answer that. Because one of the words, the terms that is, tantalizing and appears perhaps only episodically in geopolitical literature is this idea of equilibrium. What is the potential self-stabilizing balance that can be achieved among actors in a system? What does that look like? Have we ever had it? Could we have it? What might it look like today? And so that, in a way, is what I'm trying to get at. And so in this presentation, initially, I'll certainly veer between theory and practice, but obviously with the intent that we dig deep into what we as scholars and practitioners can do today, maybe to bring such a state of affairs about. So let me begin. And of course, I can't help but be nostalgic in a conversation such as this. Just speaking about geopolitics itself in a pure sense, pure or applied, is just a rare treat. So again, very, very grateful to have this opportunity. I got to excavate, intellectually things that I've been studying, absorbing for now perhaps as much as 35 years or so. And so it's a great pleasure. And of course, that is perhaps one of the reasons why you yourselves were drawn to create this, because in times of turbulence, you reach for timelessness and ideas that are timeless. Geopolitics is as timeless as it gets when one thinks about fields of social inquiry. So one of the things that one learns, and I dug this, I didn't have to dig this out because I remember my first college course on geopolitics, where you think, of course, about the geographic loci of power historically, or you reflect on those that were or have been and are in the present. And it becomes what I simplify as the tale of two continents, right? Two seats of power, but many powers across these geographical continental planes, planes on which geopolitics is sort of grounded, even at its global. And when we think geopolitically, we often do think hierarchically. So, if nothing else, we think about these as the two most powerful spatial domains of geopolitics, North America and Eurasia. Eurasia, obviously, having a long and distinguished geopolitical history before North America entered the picture, so to speak. But taken together today, and then bracketing out the rest is what I, in a way, intentionally did with this set of images, because the rest, for those who remember some arcane geopolitical, literature from the 19th century, was often called the quarter sphere of marginality. Now, that's not exactly a woke, a sort of friendly term, that's for sure. But it is the way in which, many scholars thought about geopolitics prior to the completion, you might say, of the world system's connectivity in the late 19th through the 18th, 19th centuries. Now, I'm going to come back to this almost to argue the opposite, which is to say, and as the title suggests, when we're talking about a network, we're looking at a fairly global landscape of geopolitics today, and the connectivity among nodes in a network, weak or small, most certainly has an impact on power dynamics among the key centers. But I wanted to bring it back, of course, first and foremost to the geography, right? That is really the key here. And when you think about the power centers, again, historically and today, it does fundamentally center upon North America and Eurasia, and also, of course, the relationship between the two. And in one of Kissinger's, latter formulations, latter in the case of someone who to be a centenarian, we'll be talking about the 1990s. So one of his latter formulations was that the preservation of Eurasian equilibrium was one of the critical objectives of American grand strategy or Western grand strategy. But here, of course, I'm applying the term, you might say, at global scale. But that said, equilibrium within the reduced scale of Eurasia, which is itself obviously a wide canvas, remains as paramount as ever. And we know that that is an abiding concern of U.S. grand strategy today. So I will also focus a fair bit on this question of Eurasian equilibrium and what that looks like. Now, I also wanted to take a slight historical detour for several reasons, because classical geopolitical narratives, those that we're familiar with from ancient Greek history, Thucydides, and other scholars and historians of the time, don't necessarily themselves directly articulate theory, right? We derive theory from them, right? From their narratives, from the history. And we often overlook, certainly in our Western conversations, a figure, Kautilya in this case, Chanakya as he's known in India as well, who was the chief minister to Chandragupta Maurya of the Gupta Empire, well over 2,000 years ago. Now, what's important about Kautilya, and the reason I raise him here, is because he was actually not only a theorist and a practitioner, but a successful one of geopolitics. Often we look back, and again, we have historical observers of the geopolitical landscape. We have great generals and figures who have commented on principles that we now ascribe to classical geopolitics. But Kautilya was actually quite formulaic and theoretical, and a successful practitioner of an empire that, of course, many people today would never have heard of, that successfully maintained dominance in its core geography and extended beyond for several centuries. And he actually had influence over several generations of rulers, the time of the Gupta Empire. And I guess, and I put this here in the second bullet point, for those who aren't familiar with what was known as the mandala theory, right, of power dynamics. The mandala being the circular formation. The central state is the core power. It's surrounded by natural rivals, allies potentially beyond those rivals, and distant powers. He literally did say, "The enemy of my enemy is my friend." And it is, in fact, the very origin of the term that we do think of still and use today in all manner of circumstances, not even just the geopolitical. So I wanted to revive this Kautilya, and obviously because of the geographical centrality. And one of the things that probably perturbs many of us, or if it doesn't, I hope I'm planting a seed that when you notice it happening, it will annoy you. It's that the geo has often been removed from geopolitics, and that the politics has been reduced to international relations rather than the deeper forces. And as that same professor I had in 1996 used to say to us, international relations is mere meteorology, whereas geopolitics is climatology. And so not only is there a temporal distinction, but you can't lose the geo. And here, quite explicitly, of course, in Kautilya's mandala framing, is, of course, the essential reality that holds true today that one does have an immediate concern with one's own geography. The world is not a flat plane. So I think it's very, very important to bring this kind of logic back in, at least as a grounding for some of what we see today. Needless to say, I'll come around to talking about regional spheres of influence and so forth. But even just to skip ahead a moment, I mean the obvious fact that we notice when we're observing the behavior of states, whether it's Russia or China or ourselves, which is that if we can't order our own neighborhood, to put it bluntly and colloquially, right? How successful are we going to be in being global hegemons, right? And so that wisdom is also contained in this, and it provides a deep grounding. What's also important, and a thread that will come up more and more today, is what constitutes power. And he didn't think of power, of course, merely as a political, as military attributes. Of course, there was a holistic understanding of power that has carried through into geopolitical theory today. I'll come to that in just a moment. But the quality of governance, the size of population, the financial resources, and military, all of these were in some ways objective characteristics, attributes, factors of power then, and those haven't lost their currency either. And again, I'll come to a slide in a moment that goes into that. And then, of course, then he speaks to what is known as the Shadgunya, the sixfold path. So these are the options, in a way, of strategies that a power can choose. And we're going to see those at play in this discussion, and you see these at play as you observe all geopolitical behavior today. So again, this is definitely not going to be a lecture where I explicitly link Kautilya to every single matter of 21st century statecraft, but I just wanted to, reinforce some of the relevance of ancient thought. We could now jump ahead to this slide, which is really about the uses and misuses of calculations of power in geopolitics today. And this is to reinforce the point that in our modern context, geopolitics did unfortunately take something of an anti-geographical turn. And it, it again treats the world really as a closed, flat system rather than a bumpy, uneven one in which there's incredibly powerful geographical gravities. And so what I'm showing you here, not both to highlight the similarities and differences between American first and Chinese second approaches to calculating power over the last, say, half century, but then to put both in a box and speak to their limitations. Now, without going into every last item here, and I should have said at the outset, but needless to say that the slides are to be shared later on, so anyone can have them as a resource if they're useful. But the American approach, of course, focused on taking the elements of power, and here, of course, economic, demographic, political will, and so forth are factored in, which is fine in the literature that begins with David Singer or in his contemporaries, and was built upon by geopolitical theorists, those in the traditions of long cycle theory, long wave theory, hegemonic stability theory, and so forth. But there are very valid criticisms of this in terms of the weighting schema being arbitrary, because needless to say, these factors don't necessarily have equal weight in any given situation. It is a bit too biased, towards purely hard power, and insufficiently on, I don't want to say softer factors, even though soft would be the antithesis of hard, but the things that can translate, mechanisms of translation of power, which do include diplomatic alliances and relationships, which don't necessarily factor in sufficiently here. And and this is the critique I'll issue about both. It is really about context and relationality. And context and relationality may seem like terms that are postmodern intrusions into our cherished, ancient discipline. But again, they're not, because to think geographically is to think contextually and relationally. It's not a nice to have. And what I find, and I won't go into the Chinese formulation, which is really obviously just mild variation, you might say, is that neither of these approaches, again, the overall critique being the sort of quantitative turn has de-emphasized context, geographical context, and relational aspects of power calculus that should really be far more central. And that's really what the geographic centrality and gravity is what really matters, even if we strip away sort of ideologies. Now, let me make another point then about geopolitics itself. When I started studying geopolitics, it coincided directly in that very moment with the rise of the term geoeconomics and those writers who coined the term and began to flesh out its significance. I remember a famous paper by Edward Luttwak and others in this space. Then it's become a term of art. In the last couple of decades, I myself contributed, though didn't coin precisely, the term geotechnology, and lots of people have now extended that term in many dimensions. I do want to, issue a defense again of original geopolitical thought in which you did not need these distinctions, right? Whether in the study of any historical era or buried in the or quite explicit in geopolitical literature is, of course, the idea that economic power, whether it is resource endowments, currency reserves, trade balances, and other kinds of economic attributes, and then most certainly technological factors. For any given era, there is the term leading sectors. Of course, leading sectors is an original geopolitical term going back, three-quarters of a century at least. And in our analysis of any historical period or the present, we identify what are the leading sectors whose or dominance over which confers advantage in geostrategic interactions, right? So in an ideal world, we as scholars, practitioners, don't make neat divides between these three corners of the stool or triangle as if they are truly distinct domains. We have to aspire to be holistic thinkers, and I think of these as languages, and I use Kissinger's term again, deep literacy. I think of geopolitics, economics, and technology as languages, and in an ideal world, those whose task it is to think strategically are as fluent as possible in all three of these languages, and are able to synthesize them in the way that original geopolitical discourse was meant to be conducted. Without that, again, rigidly weighted formulaic structure. So this is a call to action in a way for all of us, thrown in right here in the middle. And the second reason I wanted to just put this in here at this juncture before we dive into specific geographies and the contemporary context, to de-ideologize in a way. When we're talking about geopolitics, even for the purposes of this conversation, if we're all thinking about American grand strategy, we do have to remember that geopolitics doesn't itself pick the winners, right? It doesn't take a side. It is indeed neutral. I have a slide that has so much text on it. I didn't include it because it wasn't the subject of today's lecture, but it's a whole set of work I've done on systems change. And I'll just maybe take a 30-second detour into this because geopolitics is even agnostic about the nature of the unit. And this is something that we debated endlessly in the 90s, but is so self-evident today that one almost forgets. But there's structural change, which is, of course, the change in the polarity and hierarchy in the system, the number of powers and the ranking among them. And then there's systems change, which is the change in the units themselves, cities, corporations, super empowered individuals, cyber actors, transnational terrorist groups, and states and empires, and so forth. Geopolitics is, in its absolute core, utterly agnostic about what the unit is, and it's certainly about who prevails in that. It is, in the shortest possible formulation, the relationship between power and space, and that's it. And even space being now cyberspace in ways that weren't even envisioned originally. So there are two levels at which geopolitics is agnostic. It's agnostic in terms of what unit you are addressing or what the units are in the system. And again, ideologically neutral as to who prevails in that context, which is why I put at the bottom, is the debate really democratic powers versus authoritarian powers today? Can we oversimplify? I'm going to argue we can't necessarily do that. But instead, what I'm seeing, and this is so inherent in this power triangle, is that fundamentally to prevail, you would want to have command of the newest capabilities, right, rather than be sort of trapped in legacy systems, architectures, standards, and technologies. And we'll talk a bit about standards today. So I say old versus new. Now, this is something that is not my original insight per se. It goes back to the debates in the 1980s, 1990s about what constitutes modernity when we look at the rise in comparative political systems, rival powers, especially China at the time, and whether or not China could be a dominant modern power without westernizing. And Samuel Huntington said it best. Well, he said it best actually when he spoke about even state capacity in the 1950s. But in Clash of Civilizations, he also said that modernization does not equal westernization. At the end of the day, again, in the bluntest, most materialist formulation, it is fundamentally about being newer and having stronger capabilities than what particular ideology or system one represents. So I wanted to throw that out there. Okay, so now let's jump in and have some fun. Um, but by fun, I'm simply referring to this throwaway cartoon, which I'll move beyond in just a moment. But it was, I couldn't resist when I saw this in The Economist, simply copying and pasting in a grainy image this PowerPoint slide. So let's get into how geopolitical power is flexing and playing out on the world stage today. And of course, there's a certain mild asymmetry between that previous image and this one. This one brings us back to classical, say, 19th century geopolitical logic of continentalism and pan-regionalism. And these are two terms that are as relevant as ever as we talk about the so-called Donroe Doctrine and so forth. But in fact, this is a slide or an image that I assembled about 20 years ago, actually, when I was finishing up my first book. And because it was so long, I had to make a PowerPoint deck out of it because I knew people wouldn't want to read 500 pages. And I said, what do modern spheres of influence look like, and how does classical geopolitical theory around continentalism and pan-regionalism longitudinally explain some of the dynamics in the world today, moving beyond what we know from the 20th century experience in which, again, and 19th century experience in which pan-regions were central to geopolitical thought. So today, what I do find, attractive, let's say, is that we really are aspiring towards self-sufficiency, autarky, call it, retrenchment, nearshoring, so many terms that strategic autonomy, whatever the case may be, and that many efforts being made by each major power in the system point in this direction and have pointed in this direction without us explicitly saying so until very recently. So it goes without saying that the maneuvers, in with respect to Greenland, Canada, Panama, Venezuela, Cuba, and so forth, speak to this perfectly valid, you might even say, 19th century logic of aspiring towards diminishing dependencies on globally distributed just-in-time supply chains, and instead focusing on those resources that one can procure and harness and dominate within one's own geographical radius. And that's been attractive, obviously, as an idea, historically, and clearly remains so today. I see the European Union obviously not having been designed as a project with that as its initial intent, nothing doing, of course, given that it's very much a transatlantic project in its origins in the mid 20th century, but now aspires to strategic autonomy in terms of wanting to diminish its dependence on Russian energy, has become dependent on American energy to some degree to substitute that, but the long-term outlook for Europe being one in which they're seeking to do, whatever it takes to achieve greater self-sufficiency. And then, and I'll come back to this more later, but China's Belt and Road Initiative, and the capabilities or the potential access to resources that it still has not yet fully harnessed in its own hemisphere. Now, what's interesting is that, when China launched Belt and Road 10, 15 years ago, there was this notion that, again, it was a far-flung set of tentacles and webs that was, quite borderless. But what we've seen in the last 5 years, especially since COVID, of course, is that China has recalibrated Belt and Road and made it much more of a exercise in increasing investment and integration with its immediately adjacent neighbors. So it too is pursuing much more of a regional than a global strategy than we tend to think. All of this means then suggests quite a few things, but first of all, when we simply posit these global hierarchies, G1, G2, and so forth, again, that deterritorializes what's actually going on in the world, and that global hierarchy fundamentally matters perhaps less in the future than regional ones, which would be consistent with Kautilya and with original geographically grounded logic. That said, and maybe this may sound dialectical, but I'll go back and forth, not to argue against myself, but to point out that what's very different in the world today is, of course, powers are fundamentally very connected to each other. We see that in all of the efforts that we make to disentangle supply chains, we wind up raising our trade deficit, right? To take the opposite. So in other words, there's an entire debate which would take many hours to arbitrate, and we would still never finish, about whether or not the so-called new Cold War, or what are the similarities and differences between the new Cold War and the last Cold War. And one obvious one, and I'll leave it at that for now, is how interconnected our rival systems are versus that period of time in the previous century. And then there is an inherent, call it mercantilistic logic, right, with imperialism, neo-imperialism, which is that the home market is never quite enough, right? So if we are in a world that is neo-imperial and neo-mercantile, and those are, of course, two sides of the same coin historically, one can't help but seek to extend one's reach outward for the sake of accessing markets and securing those markets as well. So even if you did not have a security dilemma among powers in a geopolitical system, which is the geopolitical logic, you might have the mercantile logic that would nonetheless sort of support expansionism commercially, strategically, and those, of course, being two sides of the same coin, as we've seen in everything from America's 19th century commercial and geopolitical expansionism to China's today. Whether the military follows the trade, or the trade, or sort of trade follows the flag, or the flag follows the trade, that is a pattern that we see repeating itself today, which is why I distilled my kind of thinking about how the logic of geopolitics plays out in now a global system, not just one of specific power blocks, as competitive connectivity, right? You don't feel sufficiently secure even when you have a higher degree of self-sufficiency, and you're even on a path towards achieving that, to simply retreat and be isolationist. Rather, power itself is defined to some degree going back to those formula, as your degree of connectivity within the network and your influence within that network. And this is to hint at, and I didn't bring in all the slides on this either, but I like to take a physics-based approach to geopolitics, right? Mass matters more than merely size, and gravity, right, is a key principle here. So simply being large is not enough. It's your degree of connectivity that determines how much leverage and ultimately influence you have in the system. And I think this is an important thing to remember as we look to the current and the future dynamics. So let me move ahead here and just reinforce the point I made earlier about the degree of connectivity among the major power centers. Note again, I'm not thinking purely in terms of nations, but really in terms of regions. I do not believe that, I'll just have to issue a disclaimer that I don't believe that Asia and China are synonymous. I live here in Asia. You see a giant map of Asia behind me. Asia is a multipolar system, certainly not it's certainly a hierarchical one, but it is a multipolar system in a multipolar world. So a brief, point about landscape, if you will, globally. I believe the world is multipolar and that we have multipolar subsystems within that global multipolar order. Asia being the one that is, the most visibly dynamic in its multipolar sort of characteristics, and we'll get into that. But speaking about the degree of the three dominant continental or regional zones, North America, Europe, and Asia, their relative degree or weight in the global trading system, though when it comes to GDP, they represent a slightly rebalanced set of statistics, but they're quite strongly interconnected, interdependent on each other to this day. And we do see, you might even say, coalitional shifts among them. You have Europe opening up to China in various ways, even though it has arguably has been and is being, as strongly threatened by Chinese commercial expansionism as North American industry has been. But that said, Europe seeks to engage, if you will, with China in among other Asian, subregions and powers like India. You just saw the Europe-India Free Trade Agreement, EU-India Free Trade Agreement being pushed forward last week, and so forth. So you have these kind of, shifting dynamics among the three centers of power, but none of them speak to isolation, and this is the fundamental point. On the bottom below the map, I'm showing the EU, Asia, EU, North America, Asia, North America volumes of flows. These are not the numbers that speak to, a system that is being completely fragmented into three isolated spheres of influence. That's the fundamental point that I want to make here. And this doesn't even speak to the rest of the world, which I'll get into in a slide or two from now. Let me first go back to the big three. So I've been a proponent, although at the beginning I said I don't believe that you can simply have a neat, simple, formal global hierarchy, G1, G2, and so forth. I do believe that we are objectively, quantitatively in a G3 world, right? There's no question that when it comes to GDP, and resources that can be marshaled by the actor in question, whether it is a state or a supranational body or coalition, we're in a big three. And this was the argument I made, 20 years ago, which speaks to the fact that if this is the world that people are now, ratifying as being emergent, it says a lot and validates the geopolitical formula that I drew upon 20 something years ago when I first made this argument about a G3 kind of system. Here, I simply wanted to, again, without going into every single detail, what is it within the domestic dynamics or internal, calculations that is leading, each of the three major powers in the system to push for its own version, its own strategic, its own strategic outreach and forays into the world. And so my first book was basically a contrast, an effort to contrast the grand strategies of the U.S., the EU, and China. And I had simple sort of heuristics for how they pursue their strategies. I spoke about China as having a consultative approach to its diplomatic relationships. The EU is having a consensus-driven approach, and the US is coalitions of the willing. Coalitions of the willing actually had only just become a term, and it thanks to the George W. Bush administration, and it seemed to capture nicely the way in which the U.S. was looking at strategic diplomacy beyond multilateralism. So here again, I'm going to move past this, but I just want to point out that the purpose of this slide is to itemize some of the ways in which you have a global expansionist logic among these three, even if they appear in their discourse to be hesitant about it. And even if we believe or have an inclination that the world is fragmenting into neat, simple, regional kinds of geographies. But I do believe that we, in fact, live in a truly globally connected system for the first time in history. That's not only, again, a material fact of physical technologies, of infrastructure, energy, transportation, communications, networks. It's also the very lively arena of diplomatic activity that ultimately, from a bottom-up perspective, and the purpose of this slide is both top-down and bottom-up, helps to lend insight into which powers are getting more connected to whom and how those connections ultimately serve as building blocks or a building block of the power that empire or superpower exercises in the system. So there's a lot going on here. So let me try to simplify and distill this. First, I'm obviously saying, as you can see, by virtue of there being a sort of web or matrix at the center of this diagram, rather than any particular flag, is that I don't really believe that we live in a singular hegemonic system in which one power is able to dictate dynamics among them in a hierarchical fashion. We obviously have been in such a system, but we're moving out of such a system. So I'm sort of skating to where the puck is going. Obviously, I could do this much more as a set of overlapping, circles, depending on the functional area we're talking about. Are we talking about the U.S. military? Are we talking about the global monetary order and so forth? I could even animate it and show certain, drift. But here, I just wanted to simultaneously emphasize that it's also a world in which, and in contrast to the idea of the quarter sphere of marginality, from the previous century, we do live in a world where every region, every continent is playing a role in some way in the system, and that they are able to engage in a certain degree of free association with each other, and that we ignore that at our peril. Because we have felt, again, this is looking at the last 20, 30 years of American diplomacy, that we still had the ability to say no, to block, to prevent certain actors from doing business, with each other and transacting with each other. But that has run into many obstacles. I mean, it's kind of flown in the face of reality itself, which is that we are seeing new coalitions forming, new diplomatic axes, new trade, technology, dyads, that are emerging across all regions of the world. And, we there's a whole, org chart, if you will, or acronym soup of those, which I'll actually get to in just a moment. So the key conceptual items that I want to underscore here, first and foremost, the idea of networks transcending hierarchies at the global domain. So yes, we have our regional hierarchies, but we also have global geopolitical networks, and those haven't gone away, whether you call them alliances or coalitions of convenience. That is contextual. The geopolitical marketplace is the term I started using a couple of decades ago. Think of geopolitics not as a monopoly, not as a sequential passage of, passing of the baton across hegemons, and something much more complex and dynamic, like a consumer in a marketplace, like yourself, the analogy being going into a grocery store and purchasing various goods and being able to choose among them. And so this is a multi-order, as a term that some scholars have used, a world of regional systems, and each regional system has a different type of order. Then multi-alignment is the other term that, starting in the early 2000s, I've been using to say that the secondary powers in the system, the swing states, the middle powers, call them emerging markets, frontier markets, whatever you want to, are very much able to take advantage of multi-alignment or take advantage of the fact that this is a marketplace and to rather than submit themselves entirely to one master, as we would presume in the colonial imperial era or in the Cold War context, are really practicing this multi-alignment to get the best deal for themselves. And that's a behavior that we see being very, very prominent in the world today. We find it difficult to get Gulf countries or Central Asian countries or even NATO members like Turkey, to line up behind one agenda. We find it difficult for liberal democracies or democracies at all to do that, looking at, say, India's relationship with Russia and so forth. So multi-alignment becomes is very active, and I don't think that this geopolitical marketplace of dynamic multi-alignment is going to go away, and that this becomes a critical point of departure for discussing whether or not we are, what type of order we are going to have in this system looking ahead. Fundamentally, to be legitimate in this system is not really a matter of moral authority. It's a matter of being perceived as being the most trusted provider of global public goods, or of any goods, whether private goods, public goods, utilities, as I'm also calling them here. And those break down into things like who is providing security, right? Is the United States still the only provider of protection of sea lanes? Well, no, we're not necessarily. Are we the only ones providing critical infrastructure? No, we're not. When it comes to other priorities that countries have, like access to capital markets, are we the only provider? No, we're not. Who is providing technological services or energy-related services and energy transition kinds of utilities? Again, it's not one, it's a marketplace. And so what you're finding from that bottom-up perspective is that countries are saying, I'm in a marketplace, I'm shopping for a country to launch my satellites. It may be India, maybe China, maybe SpaceX. I'm looking for digital public infrastructure and a low-cost AI stack. It might be a cloud-based company. It might be India. It might be a UAE firm, right? Even at a federal level. I am looking for to build up my defense industrial base. Sure, I'll get some weapons from America, but I don't want to kill switch, so I'm also going to hedge and diversify there. In every single sphere, and this is in my own business, sort of traveling around and meeting with leaders in dozens of countries, I find them all practicing this multi-alignment very, very actively. Again, so much to say on that. I'm going to have to skip ahead quite a lot because I've already eaten up almost all the time and haven't even really gotten to the punchline. So don't worry, Roger. I'm going to accelerate drastically now and leave you all to mull over the slides later on. But the structural conditions on the left that I believe we can take as a given for the present and the future versus the ways in which these are being played out. The deeper point about what I'm calling who's bringing the public goods. This is simply to say that we are seeing this fragmentation from the notion of any possibility, not that I ever believed it to be the case, and obviously geopoliticians are skeptical, geopolitical thinkers are skeptical of multilateral systems in which you seek to graft a diplomatic solution onto very uneven power dynamics. When you look at things actually from the perspective of this network approach, you find that you have again a vast array in this marketplace of entities that are providing those public goods. So I've broken it down in this way, and I hope it's helpful. We think in categorical terms, in thematic and functional terms, and we look at who actually is providing them today and in the future. And we don't see either a single hegemon, which is the point, or a multilateral, institution providing these. We see fragmentation. And I'm okay with that, from an analytical standpoint and even perhaps a normative one. But I wanted to simply underscore this is the landscape of geopolitics today, not anything ideological per se. I emphasize that further here by looking at the rise of new country clubs, as I call them. Some people, when I first started looking at the activity of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, only about 4 people in Washington had ever heard of it. So I decided to go and spend time in those countries and look at how it was emerging. It isn't actually a global NATO by any stretch of the imagination right now, but I wanted to here simply create a Venn diagram to show the countries that are practicing actively this multi-alignment across different coalitions. And what you'll find zooming in just quickly to the countries in the middle, the countries that are appearing so much in the news today, Turkey, India, UAE, Saudi Arabia, are precisely the ones that are the most actively not choosing sides and instead saying, not least I might add, by virtue of their geography, that they do have the geographical luxury of playing all sides, and we could not possibly assume that they would be our reliable anchors in foreign regions when they take a Caucasian view of their own geopolitical landscape. So you simply cannot talk countries out of multi-alignment today. Do start with their geography first. And so I think that this is a useful term. And I'm adding and dropping country names to this all the time. Let's get into this idea of, global rimland and coalitions versus, heartland, or what an open network looks like. This is an interesting approach that was taken by a couple of scholars recently. Or some think tanks that are starting to kind of do, alliance-based calculus of power rather than simply a unit-based or nation-based approach. And what you find, and that's the message here, is that China alone is immensely powerful in terms of its capacity and capabilities. Whereas if you think about the U.S. Coalition or set of allies. I put the word block here because it's used generally. Of course, I don't believe in those rigid blocks. I believe that we have much more fungibility and sponge-like behavior rather than block-like behavior. But that said, if you were to posit, and if we in the U.S. grand strategy community were to want to bring about a new, very strong set of allies, coalitions, or a bloc, it could, in theory, nominally represent this much power, which is, again, very, very strong. So I think, imagery like this, calculations like this can help to concentrate the mind around how we need to relate to other powers in the system, given that we are no longer in a hegemonic one. One of the most important points I want to make is this slide around going back to the connectivity arms race that I posited earlier. If we were having this conversation 10 years ago, we would, on the one hand, posit that, American power is still unquestionably, unrivaled, again, on paper and even in terms of coercive capability internationally, but that China does represent a very powerful alternative model and is building an alternative set of institutions, and that we'd hand-wringing about our abdication of leadership status. In other words, we'd be saying the same things that many people are saying literally right now. However, what I wanted to demonstrate here is that geopolitics is so incredibly nonlinear despite its longue durée. And that is one of the paradoxes right now of this geopolitical moment. We deal in things that are so fundamental in terms of power calculus, and yet they're so dynamic. And I use this slide to illustrate how that appears from an institutional point of view. You had China's Belt and Road being portrayed from the outside, much more quietly, of course, from the inside, as a Chinese plot to take over the world. But what it gave rise to, the fear that it induced, if you will, in the Western system, is that we wanted to react and respond. So the counter coalitions to Belt and Road can have as profound an impact on the global system as Belt and Road itself. So what I'm getting at here, and this is where the acronym soup comes in, and you can add so many more today, but the Endless Frontier Act, Mission Clean Network, the EU's Global Gateway, Connectivity Corridors, the India-Middle East Corridor, IMEC, Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, the Pax Silica, the Mine to Magnet Initiative. The most important thing to remember is not every single one of these acronyms. It's that none of them existed 5 or 6 years ago. Right? Almost none of them existed at all. And so it's an illustration of that nonlinearity. It's the challenge and response, the action and the reaction that's occurring today in that geopolitical marketplace. And what I find, what I admire, and what I'm pleased with when I observe U.S. policy today is that not that we are wholesale jettisoning, existing multilateral institutions. We're saying, what is our functional goal in that perspective of global public goods or goods that we seek to procure in a stable fashion? What are the best instruments and tools to go out and get them? How can it be a whole greater than the sum of its parts? And which partners are going to line in a very pragmatic, realistic way, join us in doing so? And so that now brings these new coalitions, as I mentioned, whether it is those that are focused on specific categories of goods like pox silica and rare earth minerals, mapped onto the geography of historical geopolitical formulations like heartland versus rimland. So my original and tribute again to Michael. We've had great conversations about this and surely many more. What does the Rimland mean in the 21st century, right? Who would be the members? Is it AUKUS and Quad Plus, and how does that map onto the commercial dynamics of critical technologies? Who are the main actors? And can we neatly posit a heartland versus a rimland at all, as much as it's such a comfortable historical formulation for us to rely upon? Or is even this too rigid today, given the multi-alignment behavior that you see many countries participating? Because in truth, you can't look at many of the flags in what I'm calling this Rimland Plus or Global Rimland or Heartland Powers and see exclusivity. Even within across those actors, you have multi-alignment. So there's a fundamental fluidity to the dynamics today that really undermines this neat picture that we would ideally be pursuing. And though we are pursuing this on the one hand, but on the other hand, we must simultaneously evolve to what I'm calling the open network, in which we're effectively creating standards and seeking to have inclusive determination of those standards and participation in those standards, and leave that participation open to any actors in the system that qualify, whether or not they belong to one particular block or the other. And that is to come, to perhaps try to wrap up how we think in an evolutionary way about the geographical logic of the global rimland, going back to my very first slide about Eurasian equilibrium and North America as part of this, in a way, global rimland plus North America plus NATO plus Indo-Pacific allies. We can easily see on a map being a sort of global rimland, and then the new heartland axis of, say, Russia, China, North Korea, and sundry other states, and say, okay, that might work in theory, but in practice, we have to think much more about not just geographical delineations, but much more about network kinds of patterns and institutions that are more open. And as we see participants add, drop, contribute or not, be free riders, or drivers of certain processes, in that process, as it unfolds, you do come about, or you do eventually arrive at something that may resemble, the future equilibrium, which is a much more fluid geopolitics. And in a way, and this is one of the final points I'll make, is that it was ever thus, right? Because if I have, acknowledged all of the ways in which in historical geopolitical theory there's a great holistic kind of dynamic, and I did use this word equilibrium. And I think the beautiful thing about geopolitics, when we look at it historically, is that it always is finding an equilibrium, whether or not it's a stable one. And I use this slide to illustrate that just from episodes of the last 50 years. Whenever you have an effort by a hegemon to weaponize, a critical good, if you will, you have a sort of spontaneously emergent efforts by other powers or nodes in the system to diversify or democratize that good. So I put it simply here, from weaponization to democratization or diversification. I use the example of the OPEC oil shocks. We all know the consequence of that maneuver was to, in fact, it kicked off what became a decades-long process of undermining OPEC's centrality. We've now seen it with China's rare earth minerals. They awakened our tiger rather than the reverse, if you will. But our export controls, right, have pushed other countries to want to diversify, as has, of course, Taiwan being a single point of failure. And of course, our primary or financial secondary sanctions on countries are now, accelerating the wave of efforts to de-dollarize and create alternative mechanisms of trade and currency clearance and settlement. So here are, 4 or 5 episodes from just the past half century that prove how equilibrium, sort of unfolds in geopolitics through the functional lens of specific, commodities and goods. And it always falls into this pattern of weaponization to diversification, which is the process by which in geopolitical logic we talk about concentration and deconcentration, right? When we in geopolitical formula we think about the concentration of power as something we measure statically, but it is an emergent property, or it is something that changes based upon what's happening in these more micro dynamics of specific industries. So if we look at these specific behaviors, it adds up to the degree of concentration of power in the system, which is shifting as a result of these behaviors and coalitions. And so these coalitions of capabilities fundamentally, and what I call supply chain alliances, this was the kind of the core of my book, Connectography, is thinking about geopolitics not just in terms of the specific territorial unit, but in terms of the coalitions of capabilities, which is very much the term or terminology that you see the Trump administration using right now. And I give the examples of some of these functional coalitions as they're emerging today. So some of this is most certainly an endorsement of efforts to, cut through diplomatic niceties and focus on, geopolitics as stable resource procurement. Now, the final slide, and this is the one that I told Michael there was going to be a shout out to him here, because in one of our first conversations, he said, and I haven't seen your book on this or your treatise on this, Michael, so I want you to be the first to respond if you're here live. You talked about building a matrix of countries organized into this sort of 2 by 2 bracketing of interests and values. And our countries, or which countries have their interests and values aligned, or their values and not their interests, or the inverse of that. And so I wanted to simply put up here for observation, or for maybe as a point of departure, in this formulation of geography versus functionality, and as we think about strategy in terms of going beyond rigid heartland, rimland formulations and into functional coalitions and open networks, what are the pairings of partners and states, both ours with others and others with others, that fit into Michael's framework? And so I won't leave this up here, I'll take it down, but I wanted to just use this as something where we can live edit, if you will, in our conversation. But think of this as in the spirit of fluidity and fluid geopolitics in search of equilibrium. What are the categories, the buckets where we would be putting states today, and how is that going to condition or shape our behavior towards them in a very live, applied sense? So from theory to the practice, let me stop right there and look forward to a conversation about applied geopolitics with all of you, the members of the Society for Geopolitics. So apologies for going on a little bit longer, but thank you again, Roger, for hosting, and looking forward to our discussion.
Thank you so much for being here. That was great. I know it's difficult to fit everything within the time allotted, and there's a pile of things I'd like to ask. I do want to remind people you can put your questions in the Q&A. We have a few, but I'm going to use my prerogative really quickly and jump in maybe to make a couple quick comments and then ask one question that's outstanding. One, I really love your emphasis on geopolitics being agnostic. Classical geopolitics is really designed to help the state design what it's doing. Applied geopolitics is not worrying as much about whether it's good or bad, right or wrong. It's trying to figure out what is or isn't, so that businesses, people can make their decisions within that context and understand the future. And that I thought was really important. Your emphasis on context and relationality is really important. Medeski emphasizes in cycles, each cycle is different because the context is different. The technology has changed, the societal norms have changed. Each of those things change over time, and you can't look at it as static. Even geography itself changes over time based on technology, or our relationship with geography, I should say, changes over time. So I thought those are really important. I guess I'll throw one question out here, then jump to some of the others that people have put in. What about Russia? So we have a country that, to a large degree, is absent in everything you talk about. And if we look at it in pure economics and pure technology, in population size, it makes sense. It falls off the map. In disruptive capacity and in nuclear weapons, it still sits there very high on the map. How do we look at Russia in the context of the 3 spheres that you looked at Is it a fourth sphere or is it a mushy space that just is in there to cause disruptions?
Sure. An eternal question that I've always had to grapple with as well. In my first book, I had regional chapters or sections and chapters within sections. And Russia, I had to have regional commentaries, or I had to comment on Russia substantially in three different regional sections of the book. And I didn't have to do that for any other country. So there is simply that reality of geography that we have to embrace. So there's Russia in terms of its geographical relevance and then Russia in terms of its capability to influence affairs in those or other regions. And then there's Russia from the academic standpoint of its, power calculus, where, of course, in some areas, latent military capacity versus, and resource endowments versus how it translates that, again, very, very much contextually. I mean, Russia is maybe the best case study in why, size on the map is not the end all be all, right? So there's, let me also say though that in terms of that discourse and that original geopolitical quest, let's say for self-sufficiency, and autarky, Russia doesn't exercise its power through a high degree of connectivity in the system because it doesn't have that, right? It has a low degree, and it picks its spots, if you will, and it's a expansion and retreat depending on how things are going in, say, Venezuela or Syria or Africa or Central Asia, whatever the case may be. But we cannot deny that when it comes to just factor endowments, right, you have a higher capacity for self-sufficiency on paper than almost any country in the world, which is why, in a very, very painfully practical sense, I and others since 2022 have said sanctions may bite, but they're not really going to work. When you're talking about a country that borders 14 others and itself has such a staggering presence of, food, water, energy, it does have industrial capability, it does have human capital, it does have, instruments at its disposal to retool itself to arrive at a new economic equilibrium within the country. So sanctions and COVID are two things in either alone or together that actually have pushed a lot of countries towards wanting to be more self-sufficient internally. Now, Russia is struggling. There's no question about that. I'm far from positing it as a triumphant actor in this landscape. That's obviously not the case. That said, we have massively underestimated Russia. So Russia on paper being an imp, but Russia in reality being able to punch above its weight, let's say, as a result of these I don't want to say idiosyncratic factors as if they're somehow on the margin. Its size, its resource endowments are massively significant, and then this is why one has to contrast, the power formula on the one hand versus the ground truth on the other. And Russia is just exhibit A in why that gap matters so much.
Thank you. I noticed in your connection slide, a lot of that was Japan and somebody, India and somebody, or India and Japan. It's the middle powers who seem to be really taking that role, and exploiting those connections. And we do have a question here that actually relates to that. When we're looking at countries that are looking at those geopolitical advantages from being able to play in multi-alignment, do you see any ones that are becoming more effective or more active that are surprising to you, that aren't the typical Turkey and Poland and Japan and
Yeah.
India? What are some of the ones you're seeing that are being successful that maybe are less known or are emerging to find new capabilities?
Yeah, that's a great question. If you go back to, I recall, Paul Kennedy's work on this in the early 2000s when he started talking about swing states and kind of, classifying that as a category. That was one of the inspirations for my terminology, second world states, in which I repurposed that old term to apply to these sort of middle powers. And I took a broader basket than he did. He took an explicitly regional approach and identified one or two states that were the swing states in each region. And I took three or four in each region. And of course, we were talking about the Turkeys and the Polands, and Brazils at the time. And he rightly was as well. But, 20 years ago, we weren't talking about the UAE as nearly as much as we are today, to take one example. Of course, India was going to be one of those swing states. So no points for having it on your bingo card in the 90s or 2000s. But the UAE wasn't, and it is clearly so central in many of these dynamics. I have a curious history with the country because I spent my childhood there, and I spend a lot of time there today. And what I have seen is, and this is just a fun demographic fact for people, when the country was attained independence in 1971, it had 200,000 people. It was known as the Trucial States back then. Um, and today it has 12 million people. So it's increased 60x in population, probably more than 60x in GDP. Needless to say, it's $1 trillion economy, 800, 900 billion at this point, and is really harnessing its geography, right? It views itself quite literally. I mean, this is Abu Dhabi's own commercial slogan is we are the capital of capital. It views itself as the center of the world, right? In many ways, large or small. I view it more as one of these places that is trying to be a regional anchor, an eye of the storm, because it is a storm in that region of West Asia and the Middle East, and wants to play that Switzerland role, that Singapore role. What Singapore is in Southeast Asia, and what Switzerland is in Europe, the UAE is trying to be in the Middle East and beyond in concentric circles, right, of influence. Now they also advance and retreat. Look at what they're facing, or the backlash that they've suffered at the hands of their regional rivalry with Saudi Arabia just now. We've seen it in the Horn of Africa. We see it in Yemen. We see it in the Abraham Accords, or disintegration thereof. So, but I would stick that, I'll highlight that country. We can obviously have the same conversation about, say, Kazakhstan, which didn't get as much attention, 20 years ago as it does now, but I think it deserves it. So we see, let's say, rise and decline in the diplomatic hierarchy among those swing states. But those places that are real players right now, are the UAEs and the Kazakhstans that are reshaping the regional environment and making an imprint on these coalitions. And coalitions may succeed or fail based upon whether or not these powers play ball. And so this is why I take that bottom-up approach, in my work, kind of go into the psychoanalysis of each of these countries, because if we're not satisfying their approach to multi-alignment, we won't have them in our coalition. They will, lean or tilt more towards the other coalitions.
There's a question here, and I won't fully rephrase it because it's written well. How do you think about the enforcement of the open standards that you've been talking about in talking about kind of the way these different countries work? I guess it's easy to end up in a prisoner's dilemma where defection is, the optimal move to break out of there. Do you have examples of how you've seen this work, or what are the sort of comparisons that you would make to this?
Yeah. I think lock-in is very difficult, right? And because you may have tried to attempt technological lock-in, as quite frankly, the US military, defense industrial complex with allied nations and client states has succeeded at, right, for a couple of generations masterfully. But even within that, you have leakage, right? You have leakage in the sense that you do have countries violating dual use export agreements, and having spillover effects towards their own defense ecosystem so that they can eventually reduce their dependence on the core provider, and so forth. So over time, it is impossible to fully keep a genie in the bottle, right? And so we're seeing this now with semiconductor leakage and export controls, whether it's Malaysia or other countries that are, UAE as well. So extremely difficult in the context of multi-alignment to impose rigidity in these coalitions, which is why, which is the whole purpose of this argument, that we will have to, we can't really view the Rimland Plus as a strictly enforceable, alliance, right? It's not going to work because countries will see themselves at the center and seek to multi-align. So, you basically, so long one must assume that there's going to be leakage, just as there is with sanctions as well. So you simply want to have them, as much on side as possible, or use various means to limit the advanced degree of the real tension at the heart of the question is, are you giving client states or secondary participants enough access to the leading technology to keep them in, while limiting their secondary use of it and leaking it to adversaries out, right? And that's what we face today, every single day, in the question of export controls and joint development and dual use and so forth. And I don't think that there's only a good theoretical answer, but in practice, we take those one technology at a time and one coalition at a time. But from our point of view, knowing that that leakage happens, ultimately we're making a cost benefit analysis, right, around what what contributions another player is making in that coalition. So right now we need compute, so we say, well, we're going to externalize that compute to the UAE, right? We need critical minerals, so we're going to jettison preferences over regime type in favor of ensuring we get critical minerals, and those kinds of trade-offs are the stuff of diplomacy today.
We'll hit a couple more questions here. I know we've gone over your time, but as long as you're willing, I'll throw a couple more at you from the audience. One of them asks, and this actually was in the 2x2 matrix chart too, with the current U.S. administration's rejection of renewables as a goal. Do we see a closer alignment between the United States and Saudi Arabia? How would that impact U.S.-Israel relations? And I'll throw in a third slice to that. Does Saudi Arabia perceive the U.S.'s move on Venezuela and potentially on Iran as challenging their role in oil, and how would that affect the other
Yeah.
the other piece of that triangle?
Great question. I think there's sort of micro dynamics and then there's macro dynamics to answer this question. So first, I don't really think that the pullback in federal subsidies for certain renewables is going to, it may slow commercialization, but it's still a technological train that's left the station. And critical minerals feed renewable technology, not hydrocarbon energy. That's why mineral prices are going up. Oil and gas is generally going down. So that's the only data point you need um, to counter the premise of the question, right? Which is that government support fundamentally is going to drive the progress of renewables. That's simply not true. It's a material question and a technological question, and that's a good thing because ultimately our objective is abundance, right? Our objective is whether abundance through diversification of inputs of energy. And volume and capacity within those types of energy. So now the bigger question is an interesting one. I see, peak oil demand, right? Not supply, 90 million barrels per day and probably, coming down from there. And of course, generating a structural oversupply now through ramping up Venezuelan production and so forth. And in general, just the exploration activity that China and others have contributed, and if and even India and eventually Russia comes back on stream, you can't fight against the fact that there is sufficient supply and therefore there's a cap. If we go back 30 years, as you know very well, historical episodes have had an ever diminishing impact on oil price spikes, right? Saddam invades Kuwait, oil at the pump goes up to God knows how many dollars. Because this is right around the time my brother got his driver's license and he was like, Mom, Dad, don't make me pay for gas. Right. So I remember this. We don't really do that anymore. We hem and haw a little bit. But the fact is, you have global production, global distribution, global capacity. We have as much oil and gas as we're ever going to need, and we have this massive increase in the renewable side. So I don't see the supply side constraint there. And so, oil is now hovering between 65 and 70, not between 150 and 160. Right? Let's be clear. That's a massive, massive difference there. So now OPEC can reduce production a little bit temporarily, as it's doing now, serve their own purposes since they actually do have a finite supply. But in the long run, they too need to focus more, as they are doing, on selling more of it while the price is high to meet their very, very fine budgetary, balance. And investing more in renewables domestically. So you've seen the Gulf economies do this and say, let's go renewables domestically, even nuclear, as the UAE has done, and sell as much, profit as much from oil as it structurally declines. That's the meta cycle, the large cycle that we're in irrespective of the microcycles. And then that will have an impact on day-to-day dynamics between, countries and their relations. But those will be just episodes within this irreversible kind of megatrend towards abundance.
So there's a question here on how would you address claims for U.S. exceptionalism within a broader framework of geopolitics?
Well, I think you and I agree on this that every empire in history believes it's exceptional, and we have every reason to define what we mean by our exceptionalism and therefore claim that exceptionalism in a tautological way. But that doesn't obviate others' ability to do the same thing, which is, of course, what they do. So spend any time in Russia, China, Europe and India, and everyone has their own exceptionalism. So again, there's entire books that we've written and read about this, but I'll just almost leave it at that for now. Again, let's go back to just geopolitics being agnostic.
Yeah, and I think I like that. I was about to throw in if you didn't get there, it's agnostic.
Yeah,
That's how we look at it.
yeah.
Um, and let me leave with one more. We'll finish up here with one more question, and that goes back to your main theme. And this is the question on equilibrium. And I know in my work and the work we used to do at Stratfor, we long talked about global equilibrium and balance and how the world seeks balance. And in the post-Cold War world, we anticipated a swing back by the rest of the world to constrain U.S. power. Um, Even if the U.S. wasn't intentionally dominating, it was just by default that way. And this idea of equilibrium. Do you see equilibrium as something that is moving towards stasis, or is equilibrium always going to be in flux? And either way, how should we be thinking of that back to the applied geopolitics in the way in which international organizations, businesses, and things can be looking at the world in the short, medium, and long term?
Right. So, straight up geopolitics would identify this as a period of deconcentration, right? So, that's obviously what's underway. So, in physics terms, one might say it's entropic, but that doesn't necessarily imply this sort of, stasis, if you will. So I would say in applied geopolitics terms, I'd go back to the term that was on my geopolitical marketplace side, which is a multi-order world. So, looking bottom up, regional orders that are quite distinct. Some are hierarchical, some are more, kind of consensus driven. So, the European regional order is quite distinct from the North American order, which is different from what I'm calling the multipolar and hotly contested and dynamic Asian order. And so, it is far more accurate to look at the dynamics within each order first. Then look at the powers that have global capacity, global capability, United States and China in particular, and then contrast how their strategies are playing out at the global level. And those strategies are different, and they have different pace, intensity, and trajectory, if you will, right now. And that's where I view this challenge and response in the Toynbeean sense of dynamic and that notion of the all roads don't lead to China coming into play, where our response to the China challenge is incredibly exciting and lively right now. And in terms of applied geopolitics in the real world of .gov, .mil, we should be incredibly excited. Again, we're coming out of a period. I've refrained from being partisan or ideological here. I certainly was trained in the tradition of, domestic politics stops at the water's edge. And I don't intend to be partisan or ideological here, irrespective of whether we are for or against, whatever specific policies have been pursued by the last, again, Democrat and Republican alternatingly administrations the past 30, 40 years. Right now, 2026 is an amazing time to be, whether in a government, US government, or in a corporate sense, looking at the world and saying, where can we add value? Where can we build coalitions? There is concerns about our erratic behavior, but there's most certainly structural concerns about China as well. Can we be the trusted provider of utilities? And look at it again in that truly agnostic way. Not do you like us more than you like them, right? Are we better? Right? Are we better? And that's what the consumer in this geopolitical marketplace, that's what the swing states want to see is are we better? So it's a time to kind of, put our money where our mouth is and step up. And I see us in that roster, that raft of acronym soup of initiatives that we are launching. Some will succeed, some will fail. But I see a phenomenal energy and effort underway, in the diplomatic arena and in maybe in the commercial domain. Look at our AI companies, going around the world and building those partnerships. I think that there's no question that this open network approach is the one that is going to hopefully help us succeed in contrast to the Chinese approach, which is also a platform. Let's be clear. China has succeeded significantly in offering faster, better, cheaper public goods, particularly infrastructure and to some degree in technology as well, and is now making intrusions into the financial monetary arena through successfully. But we won't be able to counter it alone. But I do believe that all of the potential and actual and potential members of this so-called open network do stack up to something greater. But it's going to require this persistent, perpetual nurturing, which is hopefully not a function of just what people think of as our relatively declining status and capacity in the system, but rather a function of will, and agency, and having high agency actors, many of them public and private, and having those be, representatives and coalition builders is what we are doing, even if we don't say we're doing it, even if we don't articulate it well, though sometimes we do in fact articulate it well. That's where I see the opportunity. And then I guess to come full circle and to close, that's how equilibrium, is playing out in this very hotly, dynamically contested, real time sort of way. And there isn't an end state, right? There is never an end state. It is this perpetual calibration, and we're in one of those periods where simply pointing out concentration to deconcentration makes things appear linear, but the perturbations under the surface are anything but calm. And so personally, I think that this is going to be a dynamic, again, in search of equilibrium is what I might have called this, that will play out over decades. And then that's riveting, quite frankly. So I don't think that we're going to get any sleep for quite a while to come.
So I know there's tons more we can go over, but that's an excellent place to wrap this up for today. For anybody who's new in the field or entering the field, this just reminds us that we're going to be busy and not out of work for a while. I think the idea of change and recognizing that idea of change and being able to look forward and anticipate change and then think about its meaning and its implications is so important. I think you've done a great job of bringing some of that forward here.
Thank you. Thank you again. And congratulations, really, to you, the Society for Geopolitics. Fantastic initiative. And I'm honored to have been able to join you today and to be part of whatever you do moving forward.
Well, thank you so much. And like I said, this is a great first presentation for our S4Geo speaker series. Next month, we're going to have Rudolf Lohmeyer, a senior partner at Carney Foresight, and we'll be discussing strategic scenarios and other tools of the trade. For anybody who's here, you can register and see a list of upcoming presentations and discussions on the events page at s4geo.org. You can join our mailing list, follow us on LinkedIn to stay up to date with our initiatives in this inaugural year, reach out with ideas, reach out with focal areas or suggestions. And once again, I want to give a big thank you to you, Dr. Parag Khanna, CEO of Alpha Geo, for an excellent presentation and a great start to this year.